At the end of the last video, I mentioned a little bit of a problem that we're going to have with our current setup. Now, our current setup is fine. However, if we test our movie, and let's say that we click on the About Us page, but before the animation is finished, we click on something else. So we click on About Us and then Contact very quickly, and we just get some funky things that happen, some flickering pages here. And although it's not too big of a deal, it is a little bit distracting, and we don't want it to work like that. So what we're going to do is whenever we click on a button, as the current page is animating off, we're going to disable all of our buttons. And we're not going to enable them again until our animation is finished. So while the animations are occurring, the user's not going to be able to click on any of our buttons. But once the animations have finished, they're going to be able to click again. So let's close our preview and let's take a look at how we can do that. So we'll click on frame 1 of our actions layer, hit F9 or Option F9 to open up your actions. And there we go. Okay, so when the first thing you need to ask yourself is, at what point are we going to disable our buttons? Well, we're going to disable our buttons whenever we click on one of our buttons. So if we click on one of these buttons, we're going to call the onClick function. So in the onClick function, that's where we need to disable all of our buttons, okay? So we'll come down here to the onClick function. We'll set the next page equal to whatever, and we can do this before or after we do that. Let's just go to the beginning, and let's turn all of our buttons off. So home_mc dot enabled, oops, helps if you spell it right, enabled equals false. And we'll do that for all of our buttons. About_mc dot enabled equals false. Contact_mc dot enabled equals false. And products_mc dot enabled equals false. Okay, now we test our movie, Control Enter, and hopefully once we click on one of these buttons, all of our buttons will become disabled. So I'm going to try to click on About Us and then immediately click on Contact, and we see it doesn't work. In fact, we don't even get the pointer cursor. And now when we hover over everything, even after the animation has finished, well, it looks like it's still, the pages are still working, but we no longer get that pointer cursor. So we still need to change some code. We've disabled our buttons, which simply means that we no longer get that pointer cursor there, but we also need to disable all of these event listeners that we've created. Okay, so let's just highlight all of these, copy them, all 4 of these event listeners for our buttons. We'll come down to our onClick, and after we've disabled all of these, we'll paste that code, and let's go ahead and indent it properly. And instead of add event listener, we're just going to change that to remove event listener. So not only are we disabling the buttons, which means that we're just taking away the pointer cursor, but we're also removing the event listeners from those buttons so that we can no longer actually click on them to cause something to happen. So Control Enter to test. Now I'm going to click on Home and I'm going to click on About Us and then immediately try to click on Contact. So About Us, Contact, and it's not doing anything. We try to click on anything now and everything is completely disabled, which is what we were going for. Okay, now obviously when the next page finishes animating on, we want to re-enable everything. So we need to do that. And we're going to do that whenever the next page has finished animating. So if we go down to our on tween, which is where the next page animates on, we have our tween down here at the bottom, and we don't want to enable our buttons until this tween is finished. Okay, so we need to create an event listener for this tween that's going to listen for that motion to be finished. So we'll go to the next line at the bottom of our onTween function, but still inside that closing curly bracket, and we'll say tween on dot add event listener. The event listener we're listening for is an instance of tween event, or a method of tween event called motion. We can scroll down here, motion finish, comma space, and then we need to create a function where we're going to re-enable everything. So let's just call the function enable all. Okay, so now outside of the onTween function, we'll skip a couple lines and we'll create a new function called enable all. And this is being called by an event listener, so we need to create our event variable here. So e::tween event. It's not going to return any value, so colon void. We'll type our opening and closing parentheses here, and then inside this function we want to re-enable all of our buttons. So what we can do is let's highlight all of these where we're disabling them. Control C to copy. And then we'll just paste that here. So we'll now get our finger cursor again, but now we need to apply those event listeners again. So let's come up here to the top where we created these event listeners for all of our buttons. We'll copy that code, and then inside our enable all function, we'll go to the next line, Control V to paste. And then let's just indent everything properly here. So we've re-enabled all of our buttons, and we've added our event listeners to the buttons again so that we can click to go from page to page. And we did all of this once our next movie clip finished animating on. So let's test that. Control Enter. I'm going to try to click on About Us and then immediately on Contact. So About Us, Contact, and we see that it never did go to Contact. We didn't get any of that flickering movie clip thing. Instead, it just animated on as usual. But now, if we hover over our buttons, well, they should be, in our code, we never changed this back to true. So we saw that our event listeners were working again, but we weren't getting our hand cursor because we forgot to change that from false to true. Okay, Control Enter to test. Now it should work. Okay, About Us, try to click on Contact. It doesn't happen, but now that the animation is finished, we get our hand cursor again, and we can continue as usual. Now, if you don't want your users to have to go that long without clicking on another button, then you can change the frequency or the speed at which these tweens occur. And we can do that inside the tweens themselves. So we have the off tween here. Let's say we just wanted it to take half a second. So we could say 0.5 true, or we could use our frames. We're at 12 frames per second. So if we want it to take half a second, we could just change this from 1 true to 6 comma false. So that false tells us that we're not using seconds, and instead this number will be interpreted as frames. So we're going to take 6 frames instead of 1 whole second. And so we'll do that for the tween on. Change this to 6 comma false. And now when we test our movie, we've got the exact same functionality, except everything's just occurring a little bit quicker. That way the users don't have this extended period of time where they can't click on buttons. That might be a little confusing. But hopefully all this made sense. And now we have a fully functional website created in ActionScript, and we can see how this is a lot more flexible than trying to create transitions using the timeline by creating tweens on the timeline. Because with tweens on the timeline, it's going to be really hard to create this animation where the previous page or the current page animates off before the next page animates on. It's just hard to create that kind of dynamic functionality when you're just dealing with tweens on the timeline. So anytime you can get away with using animation in ActionScript, especially when you're dealing with something dynamic like this, you're probably going to be better off for it. So let's close that. We'll close this, and we'll save this as astransitions04.fla. So we'll save that, and we'll move on with the next video.